My MIL poisoned my wedding cake because I didn't ask her permission to marry her son. I should have known something was wrong when Sandra showed up at the venue 4 hours before the ceremony. I was in the bridal suite with my sister Olivia and my best friend Kayla, still in my robe with my hair in rollers, when I heard her voice echoing down the hallway. She was talking to someone about the cake delivery, her tone that particular blend of sweet and sharp that made my shoulders tense automatically. Olivia caught my eye in the mirror and mouthed, "Want me to handle it?" I shook my head, because avoiding Sandra only made things worse. She'd find a way to make it about disrespect, about how I was pushing her out of her only son's life, about how she'd raised Eric by herself after his father died, and this was how I repaid her sacrifice. I'd heard all the speeches before, delivered with tears in her eyes and trembling hands, that somehow never stopped her from doing exactly what she wanted. The venue was a restored barn on the edge of wine country, all exposed beams and string lights and windows that looked out over rows of grapevines turning gold in the September sun. We'd chosen it specifically because it was 2 hours from Sandra's house, far enough that she couldn't just drop by during the planning process. Eric and I had been engaged for 14 months, and in that time Sandra had tried to insert herself into every single decision. She'd shown up at the florist and changed our order to include her favorite flowers. She'd called the photographer and requested a private mother-son session before the ceremony without telling us. She'd sent the caterer a completely different menu than the one we'd selected, then acted shocked when they called to confirm which version we actually wanted. Each time, Eric would have a conversation with her about boundaries. Each time, she'd cry and apologize and promise to respect our wishes. And each time, within a week, she'd do something else. I walked out to the main hall in my robe and slippers to find Sandra standing next to the cake table with the delivery team. The cake was a 4-tier masterpiece, white fondant with cascading sugar flowers in dusty rose and sage green, delicate gold leaf accents catching the morning light. We'd spent months designing it with the baker, a woman named Lisa, who ran a small shop in the city and specialized in organic ingredients and intricate sugar work. It had cost more than I wanted to admit, but Eric had insisted because he knew I'd been dreaming about my wedding cake since I was a little girl. Now Sandra was circling it like a predator, her fingers hovering over the flowers, her head tilted in that critical way she had when she was about to find fault with something. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that looked suspiciously bridal, her hair done in an elaborate updo that probably took 2 hours at the salon. I'd specifically asked her not to wear white or cream, or anything that could be mistaken for a wedding dress. She'd agreed with a tight smile and promised she understood. "There you are, sweetheart," Sandra said when she saw me, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I just wanted to make sure the cake arrived safely. You know how important this day is. Everything has to be perfect." She reached out and touched one of the sugar flowers, her nail scraping against the delicate petals. I saw Lisa, the baker, flinch from where she stood near the door with her assistant. "It's beautiful," Sandra continued, "but I think something might be off with the frosting on this tier." She pointed to the second layer, running her finger along the edge. "See? It looks a little uneven here. I'm sure Lisa can fix it real quick, right, Lisa?" The baker stepped forward, her face professional but her eyes wary. She'd dealt with Sandra before, during our tasting appointment when Sandra had shown up uninvited and spent an hour criticizing every flavor, combination we liked. Lisa examined the tier Sandra was pointing at and shook her head slowly. "Actually, that's exactly how it's supposed to look. It's a textured buttercream technique. We discussed this during your final consultation." Sandra pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed at the frosting before anyone could stop her. "Well, I just think it could use a little smoothing. There, see? Much better." She'd left a visible mark where her tissue had pressed into the buttercream, disrupting the carefully crafted texture. Lisa's jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything. She and her assistant had been working since dawn to deliver cakes to 3 different venues, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Sandra," I said, keeping my voice level, "please don't touch the cake. Lisa knows what she's doing." Sandra turned to me with that wounded expression she'd perfected over the years, her eyes going wide and glassy. "I'm just trying to help, honey. I want everything to be perfect for you and Eric. You know I only want what's best for my boy." She emphasized the last 2 words just slightly, a reminder that Eric was hers first, that I was the interloper in their relationship, that no matter how much he loved me, she would always have a claim on him that I couldn't touch. Olivia appeared at my elbow, her hand warm on my arm. "The photographer is here," she said, her tone making it clear this was an excuse. "We need to get back upstairs for hair and makeup." I nodded gratefully and turned to leave, but Sandra's voice stopped me. "Oh, before you go, I brought something for you. A little wedding day surprise." She reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a small velvet box. My stomach dropped because Sandra's gifts always came with strings attached, invisible threads that she'd pull later to remind me of her generosity. It's the necklace I wore when I married Eric's father. I want you to wear it today, to feel connected to our family. History. She opened the box to reveal an ornate gold pendant with a large opal in the center, surrounded by small diamonds. It was beautiful in an old-fashioned way, but it was also completely wrong for my dress, which had a simple, modern neckline that didn't need any jewelry at all. That's very thoughtful, I started, but I've already chosen my jewelry for today. Sandra's face hardened for just a fraction of a second before the wounded expression returned. Of course you have. I should have known you wouldn't want anything from Eric's family. You've made it very clear that your traditions are the only ones that matter. She closed the box with a sharp snap and dropped it back into her purse. I'll just go find Eric then. Maybe he'll appreciate the gesture even if you don't. She turned and walked toward the groom's quarters on the other side of the venue, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with aggressive precision. Lisa caught my eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry," before she and her assistant hurried out to their van. Olivia steered me back toward the bridal suite, her hand firm on my shoulder. "Don't let her ruin this day," she whispered. "In 6 hours you'll be married to Eric and she'll just be background noise." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, some carefully planned disaster that Sandra had been orchestrating while I was too busy with seating charts and vow writing to notice. The ceremony was supposed to start at 4 o'clock. By 3:30, I was fully dressed, my hair swept up in soft waves with baby's breath woven through it, my makeup natural except for a bold lip that Kayla had insisted would look stunning in photos. The dress was everything I'd dreamed of, ivory silk with a fitted bodice and a skirt that moved like water when I walked. My mother had helped me into it, her hands shaking slightly as she fastened the tiny buttons up my back, and when I'd turned to look in the mirror, she'd started crying. "You're so beautiful," she'd whispered, and for a moment, I'd forgotten about Sandra entirely. But then there was a knock on the door, and Eric's voice called out, "Can I come in? I know it's bad luck, but I really need to talk to you." Olivia opened the door just enough to tell him to wait, that he couldn't see me before the ceremony, but he sounded desperate. "Please, it's about my mom. Something's wrong." My stomach clenched, and I told Olivia to let him in, to hell with superstitions. Eric looked incredible in his navy suit, his dark hair styled perfectly, his eyes bright with what should have been joy. Instead, he looked panicked. "She's having a meltdown," he said, closing the door behind him. "She just cornered me in the hallway and told me we're making a huge mistake. She said you don't really love me, that you're only marrying me because you're pregnant." I stared at him, my brain struggling to process what he'd just said. "I'm not pregnant." He held up his hands. "I know that. Obviously I know that. But she's convinced herself it's true. She said she saw a pregnancy test in your purse last month when she came over for dinner." This was insane, even by Sandra's standards. I hadn't taken a pregnancy test in over a year, and even if I had, why would I carry it around in my purse? "Eric, she's lying. She's making things up to stop the wedding." He ran his hand through his hair, disrupting the careful styling. "I know. I told her that. I told her she was being ridiculous and she needed to calm down or leave. And she just looked at me with this expression I've never seen before and said, 'Fine. If you won't listen to me, you'll have to learn the hard way.'" The ceremony happened on schedule because neither of us could figure out how to stop it without creating an even bigger scene. Eric's uncle walked me down the aisle because my father had died when I was 12, and I kept my eyes fixed on Eric waiting for me at the altar, trying not to scan the crowd for Sandra's cream-colored dress. She was sitting in the front row on the groom's side, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of emotional mother perfectly. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the marriage, my heart actually stopped for a beat, but Sandra stayed silent. Eric's vows made me cry, and when he slid the ring onto my finger, I thought maybe we'd made it through the worst of it. Maybe Sandra's threat had been empty. Maybe she'd just needed to vent and now she'd accept reality and let us have our day. I was so stupid. I'd spent 18 months watching her manipulate and scheme and sabotage, and I still thought she'd suddenly develop a conscience at the last minute. The cocktail hour was beautiful. The venue staff had set up tables on the patio overlooking the vineyards, and the setting sun painted everything gold and amber. Eric and I were in a private room doing photos with the wedding party, so I didn't see what happened next. I only found out later, after everything had already gone wrong, when Kayla pulled me aside and told me she'd seen Sandra at the cake table. "I was grabbing a glass of champagne from the bar," Kayla said, her voice low and urgent. "And I saw your mother-in-law standing next to the cake. She was alone, and she had this little plastic spoon in her hand, and she was scraping something into the frosting on the second tier. The same tier she'd messed with this morning. I thought maybe she was fixing it again or something. But then she looked around real quick like she was checking if anyone was watching, and she shoved the spoon into her purse. It was weird, but I didn't know what to do about it. I mean, what was I supposed to say? Your mother-in-law is tampering with your cake? We didn't cut the cake until almost 10 o'clock. The reception had been flowing perfectly, dinner was delicious, the toasts were funny and heartfelt, and the band had everyone dancing. Eric and I had been swept up in the joy of it, the feeling that we'd actually pulled off a beautiful wedding despite Sandra's best efforts. When the venue coordinator brought out the cake, everyone gathered around with their phones ready to capture the moment. The sugar flowers looked even more stunning under the reception lights, and I remember thinking that it was worth every penny we'd spent. Eric and I picked up the cake knife together, his hand over mine, and he whispered, "Ready to start our life together, Mrs. Morrison?" And I laughed because we'd agreed I wasn't taking his name, but hearing him say it made me happy anyway. We cut into the second tier, the one Sandra had touched twice, and I fed Eric a bite first. He made a show of trying to smash it into my face, but he was too gentle, and I got him back with a tiny dab of frosting on his nose. Then he fed me a bite. The taste was wrong immediately. Under the sweet vanilla buttercream and the light lemon cake, there was something bitter and chemical, something that made my mouth feel like it was coated in oil. I swallowed anyway because everyone was watching and taking pictures, and I didn't want to ruin the moment. But my stomach turned over, a slow roll of nausea that made me grip Eric's arm. "You okay?" he asked, his smile fading when he saw my face. I nodded, trying to play it off, but the nausea was getting worse. My mouth started watering in that specific way it does right before you throw up, and I could feel cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. "I need to sit down," I managed to say, and Eric immediately guided me toward our table. Olivia was there in seconds, her face concerned. "What's wrong? You're white as a sheet." I tried to tell her I just needed water, but my stomach clenched violently, and I knew I wasn't going to make it. I ran for the bathroom with Olivia right behind me, and I barely made it to a stall before everything came up. I spent the next hour vomiting until there was nothing left in my stomach, and then I kept vomiting anyway. Horrible dry heaves that made my ribs ache and my throat burn. Olivia held my hair and called for Eric, who came bursting into the women's bathroom looking terrified. My mother appeared with a cold washcloth and pressed it to my face, and someone called 911 because I couldn't stop shaking and my heart was racing like I'd run a marathon. The paramedics arrived and took my vitals, and when they heard I'd just eaten wedding cake, they asked if I had any food allergies. I shook my head because I'd eaten from that bakery before. I knew every ingredient in that cake. There was nothing in it that should have made me sick like this. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, asked if anyone else had eaten the cake. Eric said he'd had a bite but felt fine. "Just the bride, then," the paramedic said, and something in her tone made my skin prickle. "We need to take you to the hospital. This doesn't look like a normal food reaction." The emergency room at County General was busy for a Saturday night, but they took me back quickly when the paramedics explained my symptoms. A nurse drew blood and hooked me up to an IV, while a doctor asked me questions about what I'd eaten that day, whether I'd taken any medication, whether I'd been feeling sick before the cake. I told him everything I could remember, but my brain felt foggy, and my body felt like it belonged to someone else. Eric was next to me holding my hand, still in his wedding suit, but with his tie loosened and his hair a mess from running his hands through it. "This was supposed to be the best day of our lives," he said quietly, and I started crying because he was right. We were supposed to be at our reception, dancing our first dance, cutting the cake we'd already cut, celebrating with everyone we loved. Instead, I was in a hospital gown with an IV in my arm and the taste of vomit in my mouth, and my wedding dress was probably ruined from when I'd collapsed on the bathroom floor. The doctor came back an hour later with a strange expression on his face. "We found ipecac syrup in your system," he said. "It's a substance used to induce vomiting. Someone put it in your food." Eric stood up so fast his chair fell over. "What? That's impossible. Who would do that?" But I knew. I knew before the doctor even finished explaining that ipecac was rarely used anymore, that it had to be deliberately administered, that someone had poisoned me. I knew because I'd felt Sandra's hatred for months, had seen the calculation in her eyes every time she looked at me, had heard the threat in her voice when Eric told her to calm down or leave. "Your mother," I said, my voice hoarse from vomiting. "Your mother did this." Eric stared at me like I'd slapped him. No, my mom would never. She's been difficult about the wedding, yeah, but she wouldn't actually hurt you. That's insane." I grabbed his hand with what little strength I had left. "Eric, she was at the cake table this morning. She touched the frosting on the second tier, the same tier we cut into. And Kayla saw her at the cake table during cocktail hour with a plastic spoon, scraping something into the frosting. It was her. The police came to the hospital at 2 in the morning. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both looking exhausted and skeptical. They took our statements separately, and I told them everything I could remember about Sandra's behavior, about her threat before the ceremony, about her touching the cake twice. The female officer, whose nameplate read Officer Diaz, listened with a neutral expression that didn't tell me whether she believed me or not. "We'll need to go back to the venue and check for evidence," she said. "In the meantime, do you want to press charges?" I looked at Eric, who was staring at the floor with his jaw clenched. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know what I want except to understand why she did this." Officer Diaz nodded. "The venue manager is still. They're cleaning up. We'll talk to him and see if there's any security footage. If your mother-in-law did tamper with the cake, there should be evidence." She paused, and her professional mask slipped just slightly. "For what it's worth, I've seen cases like this before. Sometimes the people who should love us the most are the ones who hurt us the worst." Eric didn't say anything on the drive back to our hotel. We were supposed to be staying in the honeymoon suite at a resort 3 hours north, but instead, we went to the hotel where we'd reserved rooms for out-of-town guests. I was still in my hospital gown under Eric's suit jacket, and the front desk clerk's eyes went wide when she saw us. "Are you okay?" she asked, and I wanted to laugh because nothing about this was okay. Upstairs, Eric helped me out of the jacket and into one of the hotel robes, moving like he was on autopilot. "I should call my mom," he said, pulling out his phone. "I should ask her what happened." I caught his wrist. "Eric, if you call her right now, you're giving her time to come up with a story. Wait until the police have evidence." He pulled away from me, his face twisting with something between anger and grief. "You want me to believe my mother poisoned you? My mother, who raised me by herself, who worked 2 jobs to put me through college, who's difficult and controlling but who loves me. You want me to believe she's capable of this?" We didn't sleep. We sat on opposite ends of the hotel bed in silence, both of us staring at our phones, waiting for news that felt like it would never come. At 6 in the morning, Officer Diaz called. "We found a small glass jar in the bathroom trash at the venue," she said. "It was ipecac syrup, the same substance we found in your system. The venue has security cameras, and we pulled the footage. Your mother-in-law is visible on camera entering that bathroom twice yesterday, once before the ceremony and once after. The second time, she was carrying her purse and a small plastic spoon. When she came out, the spoon was gone. We also found the spoon in the trash, and it had traces of ipecac and buttercream frosting on it." My hands started shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone. "So she did it. She actually poisoned me." Officer Diaz's voice softened. "Yes. We're heading to her residence now to make an arrest. I wanted to give you a heads up in case she tries to contact you or your husband first." Eric was standing at the window when his phone rang. I watched him answer it, watched his face change as he listened to whatever his mother was saying. "Mom, slow down. What are you talking about?" His voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the tremor underneath. "The police? Why would the police be at your house?" He listened for another minute, his knuckles going white around the phone. "Mom, I need you to tell me the truth. Did you put something in our wedding cake?" The silence stretched out so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Eric's face crumpled. Oh my God, you actually did it." He sank down onto the edge of the bed, the phone still pressed to his ear. "Why? Mom, why would you do this?" I couldn't hear Sandra's response, but I watched Eric's expression cycle through disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. "That's not a reason," he said, his voice breaking. "That's not a reason to poison someone." He hung up without saying goodbye and sat there staring at nothing. "She said she was trying to make you sick enough that we'd have to postpone the wedding. She said I was rushing into marriage, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that she needed more time to make me see you weren't right for our family." The police arrested Sandra at 7:30 that morning. By 8, the story had spread to our families and wedding guests through a combination of phone calls and social media. My phone exploded with messages, everyone asking if I was okay, if it was true, if Sandra had really poisoned the wedding cake. Eric's extended family split into camps, half of them insisting Sandra would never do such a thing, and the other half saying they'd always known she had problems. Eric's aunt called him crying, saying she'd tried to warn him years ago that Sandra's obsession with him wasn't healthy, that she'd driven away every girlfriend he'd ever had with her passive-aggressive comments and manufactured crises. "She told me once that no woman would ever be good enough for you," his aunt said. "She said you were hers and hers alone, and anyone who tried to take you away would regret it. I thought she was just being dramatic. I didn't think she meant it literally." Eric hung up and threw his phone across the room, where it hit the wall and cracked. The venue manager called at 9 to tell us that Lisa the baker was devastated and wanted to remake our cake free of charge. She feels terrible even though none of this was her fault, he said. She's also willing to testify if you need her, too. She said your mother-in-law's behavior yesterday morning was aggressive and inappropriate, and she'd be happy to tell that to a judge. I thanked him and hung up, then looked at Eric. We need to decide what we're going to do. The DA's office will probably call soon about pressing charges. Eric's laugh was bitter and broken. What's there to decide? She poisoned you. She deliberately hurt you to try to control me. Of course we're pressing charges. But his eyes were red, and I could see what this was costing him. Sandra wasn't just his mother. She was the only parent he'd ever really known, the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him after his father died. Believing she was capable of poisoning me meant rewriting his entire childhood, questioning every memory, wondering if the love she'd always shown him was real or just another form of control. The preliminary hearing was 3 weeks later. I was still having nightmares about the wedding, waking up in cold sweats with the taste of that bitter cake in my mouth. Eric had moved us into a new apartment because he couldn't stand to be in our old place, where Sandra had a key and had let herself in whenever she wanted. He'd changed his phone number after she'd called him 67 times in one day from jail, leaving increasingly unhinged voicemails about how I'd turned him against her, how she was the victim here, how he'd regret choosing me over her. His therapist said he was processing a traumatic betrayal and needed time to grieve the mother he'd thought he had. My therapist said I had every right to be angry and that it was okay if I never forgave Sandra, even if Eric eventually did. But sitting in that courtroom watching Sandra in her orange jumpsuit, her hair unwashed and her face bare of makeup, I didn't feel angry. I felt sad. The prosecutor was a woman named Rebecca Chen, who specialized in domestic violence cases. She'd told us in our pre-trial meeting that she'd seen dozens of cases where mothers had committed crimes to maintain control over their adult children, and that Sandra fit a textbook pattern. She sees you as a threat to her primary relationship, Rebecca explained. In her mind, Eric exists to fulfill her emotional needs. When he chose to marry you, she perceived it as abandonment. The poisoning wasn't about hurting you specifically. It was about creating a crisis that would make Eric doubt his decision and run back to her. At the hearing, Rebecca presented the security footage showing Sandra entering the bathroom with her purse, the glass jar of Ipecac found in the trash, the plastic spoon with traces of both syrup and frosting, my medical records showing Ipecac in my system, and Kayla's testimony about seeing Sandra tamper with the cake. Sandra's lawyer, a tired-looking public defender named Maxwell Hunt, argued that Sandra had been under extreme emotional distress and hadn't been thinking clearly. My client is a widow who raised her son alone under difficult circumstances, he said. She made a terrible mistake, but it came from a place of fear, not malice. The judge, an older woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, listened to both sides without expression. When it was Sandra's turn to speak, she stood up and looked directly at Eric. I never meant to hurt anyone, she said, her voice trembling. I just needed more time. You were moving so fast, and I was scared I was losing you. Everything I've done for 32 years has been for you. My whole life has been about making sure you were happy and safe and loved. And then she came along and suddenly I didn't matter anymore. I wasn't trying to poison her. I just wanted her to be too sick to go through with the wedding that day. I thought if we postponed, you'd have time to think, to see that you were making a mistake. The judge's expression didn't change. Mrs. Morrison, you administered a toxic substance to your daughter-in-law with the intent to cause her physical harm. Your motivation doesn't make that action any less criminal. You could have killed her. The fact that you claim to love your son doesn't give you the right to assault the woman he chose to marry. Sandra's face crumpled, and she started to sob, but the judge continued. Bail is set at $50,000. Trial date will be set within 60 days. Eric's aunt posted bail the next day. She called Eric to tell him, her voice apologetic. I know you're angry with her, but she's still family. I can't let her sit in jail. Eric's response was cold. She poisoned my wife. She's not my family anymore. But I knew it wasn't that simple. I'd see him sometimes late at night, scrolling through old photos on his phone, pictures of him and Sandra when he was a kid. In one, he was maybe 6 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, and Sandra was holding him with her face pressed against his cheek. She looked so young and so tired and so full of love. That woman and the woman who'd poisoned me were the same person, and Eric was trying to figure out how both versions could be true. His therapist said it was normal to grieve the parent you thought you had while also being angry at the parent you got. I didn't have any advice because I'd never had to reconcile those two things. My mother was complicated, but she'd never tried to hurt someone I loved. The trial started in November on a gray Monday morning that smelled like rain. The courthouse was downtown in an old building with marble floors and high ceilings that made everyone's footsteps echo. Eric and I sat in the front row on the prosecution's side, and Sandra sat at the defendant's table looking small and fragile in a navy blue dress that her lawyer had probably picked out to make her look sympathetic. The jury was a mix of ages and backgrounds, and I tried not to make eye contact with any of them because I didn't want to seem like I was trying to manipulate their sympathy. Rebecca had warned me that Sandra's defense would try to paint me as the villain, the woman who'd stolen their client's son and driven her to desperate actions. "They're going to make this about you," she'd said. "They're going to try to show that you were cruel to Sandra, that you deliberately excluded her from wedding planning, that you turned Eric against his own mother. Don't take the bait. Just tell the truth calmly and let the evidence speak for itself." The prosecution called me to testify on the second day. I walked to the witness stand with my hands shaking, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Rebecca asked me to describe my relationship with Sandra, and I told her about the 18 months of escalating control attempts, the changed florist orders, the surprise photography session, the unwanted visits to our apartment, the constant criticism disguised as concern. "Did you ever tell Mrs. Morrison that she wasn't welcome in your life?" Rebecca asked. I shook my head. "I never said that. I just tried to set normal boundaries, like asking her to call before coming over, or letting Eric and me make our own decisions about the wedding. Every time I set a boundary, she'd agree, and then ignore it." Rebecca walked me through the wedding day, asking me to describe Sandra's behavior with the cake, her threat to Eric before the ceremony, the moment I realized the cake tasted wrong. When she asked how the poisoning had affected me, my voice broke. "I spent my wedding night in a hospital instead of with my husband. I have nightmares about throwing up in front of everyone I love. I can't eat cake anymore without feeling sick. But the worst part is knowing that someone who was supposed to love Eric used me as a weapon to hurt him." Sandra's lawyer cross-examined me for over an hour, trying to poke holes in my story. "Isn't it true that you deliberately excluded Mrs. Morrison from wedding planning?" he asked. I explained that we'd invited her to join us for vendor meetings and she'd either tried to take over or made the meetings so difficult that vendors asked us not to bring her back. "Isn't it true that you refused to wear a family heirloom necklace that Mrs. Morrison offered you on your wedding day?" I explained that I'd already chosen my jewelry and the necklace didn't match my dress. "Isn't it true that you've accused Mrs. Morrison of poisoning you despite having no proof that she put anything in the cake?" I looked at the jury. "There's security footage of her tampering with the cake. There's a jar of Ipecac with her fingerprints on it. There are hospital records showing I was poisoned. I don't know what more proof you need." The lawyer narrowed his eyes. "Isn't it possible that someone else at the wedding didn't like you and decided to make you sick? Isn't it possible that you're using this situation to permanently separate Eric from his mother?" The venue manager testified about finding the Ipecac jar in the bathroom trash and reviewing security footage at the police's request. Lisa the baker testified about Sandra's aggressive behavior with the cake, both in the morning and during cocktail hour. Kayla testified about seeing Sandra scraping something into the frosting with a plastic spoon. The emergency room doctor testified about my symptoms and the Ipecac found in my blood work. The police officers testified about the evidence they'd collected and Sandra's statement when they arrested her. Each piece of testimony built on the last until the case was airtight. Sandra's lawyer tried to create reasonable doubt by suggesting that maybe someone else had put the Ipecac in the bathroom. Maybe Sandra had just been fixing the frosting like she claimed. Maybe the spoon had traces of frosting because it had been used to serve the cake earlier. But the evidence was too strong. The jar had Sandra's fingerprints. The security footage showed no one else entering that bathroom during the relevant time window. The spoon had never been used to serve cake, because it was a disposable plastic spoon from Sandra's purse, not one from the venue's catering supplies. When the prosecution rested, Sandra's lawyer called her to testify in her own defense. She took the stand wearing a soft gray cardigan over her navy dress, and she'd been crying enough that her eyes were red and swollen. Her lawyer asked her to describe her relationship with Eric, and she painted a picture of a devoted single mother who'd given up her own dreams to raise her son after her husband's tragic death. "He was only 4 when his father died," she said, her voice breaking. "I was 26 years old with no family support and no money. I worked as a waitress during the day and cleaned offices at night so I could pay for his daycare and keep a roof over our heads. Every decision I made was about giving him the best life I could. He was my whole world." Her lawyer asked her about me, and her face changed subtly. I wanted to like her. I really did. But from the beginning, she made it clear that I wasn't welcome in their relationship. She'd make little comments about how Eric's childhood sounded difficult, how she was going to give him a better family now. She'd plan things without telling me, then act surprised when I felt left out. I wanted to scream because none of that was true, But Rebecca had warned me to stay calm, no matter what Sandra said. "Did you put ipecac syrup in the wedding cake?" her lawyer asked. Sandra hesitated, and I could see her weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, I did. But I wasn't trying to hurt her, I swear. I just needed the wedding to stop. Eric was making the biggest mistake of his life, and I could see it. But he wouldn't listen to me. I thought if she got sick, they'd postpone the wedding and Eric would have time to think clearly. I never imagined it would hurt her as badly as it did. I used way less syrup than the bottle recommended. I thought she'd just feel a little nauseous, maybe throw up, once or twice, and then they'd reschedule for another day. When I saw how sick she got, I felt terrible. I wanted to confess right then, but I was scared." Her lawyer asked her if she understood that what she'd done was wrong. "Of course I do," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I made a horrible mistake. I was desperate and scared and I wasn't thinking straight. But I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted my son back." Rebecca's cross-examination was surgical. "Mrs. Morrison, you said you wanted your son back. Back from what?" Sandra blinked. "I don't understand the question." Rebecca stepped closer. "You said you wanted your son back. That implies he went somewhere. Where did Eric go?" Sandra's jaw tightened. "He didn't go anywhere. He just started prioritizing her over me." Rebecca nodded slowly. "So when you say you wanted him back, you mean you wanted to be his first priority again? You wanted him to choose you over his wife?" Sandra's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled. "Answer the question," the judge said. Sandra's voice was defensive. "I just wanted things to go back to how they were before she came along, when it was just Eric and me and we didn't need anyone else." Rebecca let that sit for a moment. "Mrs. Morrison, you've testified that you used less ipecac than the bottle recommended. How did you know what the bottle recommended?" Sandra froze. I read the label." Rebecca pulled out a photograph of the ipecac bottle found in the trash. "This bottle has no label. It's been removed. In fact, based on the adhesive residue, it appears the label was deliberately peeled off. Why would you remove the label?" The courtroom was silent. Sandra's face had gone pale. "I don't remember doing that." Rebecca's voice was sharp. "You don't remember removing the label from a bottle of poison that you then used to poison your daughter-in-law? Mrs. Morrison, removing that label suggests premeditation. It suggests you knew exactly what you were doing and you were trying to hide it." Sandra's lawyer objected again, and this time there was a brief sidebar with the judge. When they finished, Rebecca continued. "Mrs. Morrison, you've said you felt terrible when you saw how sick the bride got. Yet according to testimony from multiple witnesses, you didn't confess or try to help her. In fact, you stayed at the reception and continued to socialize with guests while the bride was in the bathroom vomiting. Why didn't you tell anyone what you'd done so she could get medical help faster?" Sandra's mouth opened and closed. "I was in shock. I didn't know what to do." Rebecca's expression was cold. "You knew exactly what to do. You just chose not to do it because you were more concerned about yourself than about the woman you'd poisoned." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Eric and I waited in a small room down the hall from the courtroom, neither of us talking much. I kept thinking about Sandra on the stand, the way she'd cried and insisted she never meant to hurt me, while simultaneously admitting she'd deliberately poisoned me. Some part of her genuinely seemed to believe both things could be true at the same time. Eric's phone buzzed with a text from his aunt. "I still can't believe she did this," it said. "I keep thinking there must be some explanation we're missing." Eric stared at the message for a long time, then typed back, "There's no explanation that makes it okay." When the jury came back, the foreman was a middle-aged man with glasses and a serious expression. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and he said yes. "On the charge of poisoning with intent to cause bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty." Sandra made a sound like a wounded animal. Her lawyer put his hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off. She turned in her seat and looked directly at Eric. "Please don't let them do this to me. I'm your mother. I love you." Eric's face was stone. He didn't respond. Sentencing was 2 weeks later. The judge could have given Sandra up to 10 years, but she settled on 4 years with the possibility of parole after 2. "Mrs. Morrison," the judge said, "you betrayed the trust of your son and his wife in the most fundamental way. You used your knowledge of their wedding plans to poison the bride out of selfish desire to maintain control over your adult son. You showed no remorse until you were caught, and even now, your testimony suggests you still don't fully understand the gravity of your actions. You need time to reflect on what you've done and to get the mental health treatment you clearly need." Sandra was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and as she passed our row, She looked at Eric one more time. "I did it because I love you," she whispered. Eric closed his eyes and didn't respond. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca told us she thought the sentence was fair and that with good behavior, Sandra would probably serve the full 2 years before parole. She'll have to complete anger management and therapy as part of her parole conditions, Rebecca explained. Whether that actually helps her or not, I can't say, but at least you'll have time to heal without her interfering. Eric and I drove home in silence. We'd moved again after the trial started, this time to a neighborhood across town where Sandra had never been. The new apartment was smaller but brighter, with big windows that let in afternoon sun. We'd repainted the whole place ourselves, spending weekends in old clothes splattered with eggshell white and sage green, and the physical work had been good for both of us. Now we sat on our second-hand couch with takeout containers neither of us had much appetite for, and Eric said, "I don't know how to feel. Part of me is relieved she's going to prison, and part of me feels like I just put my own mother away." I took his hand. "You didn't put her away. She did this to herself. You just refused to let her get away with it." He nodded, but I could see the pain in his eyes. His therapist had warned him that this was going to be a long process, that you don't just get over a parent betraying you like this. "She'll write to you from prison," his therapist had said. "She'll call if she can. She'll try to make you feel guilty for choosing your wife over her. You need to decide now what boundaries you're going to set and stick to them no matter how hard she pushes." 6 months later, Eric received his first letter from Sandra. He stared at the envelope for 3 days before opening it. Inside was 4 pages of handwriting, the same neat cursive she'd used on the note she'd left in our mailbox. She told him she was doing well in prison, taking classes and seeing a therapist twice a week. She said she was finally understanding that what she'd done was wrong, that she'd been so consumed by fear of losing him that she'd lost sight of his happiness. She said she hoped someday he could forgive her, but she understood if he couldn't. The letter ended with, "I know I destroyed our relationship, but I want you to know that everything I did came from love, even if it was a sick and twisted version of love. You deserved better from me. I'm sorry." Eric read it out loud to me, his voice steady until the last line when it broke. "What do I do with this?" he asked. I didn't have an answer because I couldn't imagine what it felt like to receive an apology from someone who'd poisoned your wife. "You don't have to decide right now," I said. "You can just sit with it." We never did have another wedding ceremony, but on our first anniversary, we invited our closest friends to a small dinner at our favorite restaurant. Lisa the baker made us a 2-tier cake, delicate chocolate layers with raspberry filling and vanilla buttercream, and when she delivered it, she hugged me tight. "I'm so glad you're okay," she whispered. "I'm so sorry your wedding day was stolen from you." But looking around that table at the people who loved us, at Eric laughing at something my sister said, at the cake that was just cake with nothing sinister hidden inside it, I realized our wedding day hadn't been stolen. It had been transformed into something else, something harder, but also more honest. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.